Good afternoon. We are Pinecone, and we're here using the Pan-Swiss studios. We're here to interview Pete Myers, who is CEO and Chief Scientist of Environmental Health Sciences. He is a world-renowned scientist and is known for his book, Our Stolen Future, and was the first one to crown the term endocrine disruption. So first of all, what inspired you to get into this field of study?
Well, I'm just so happy to be here, first of all. Pinecone's is doing some really interesting things, and at some point I want to learn where the name came from. Okay, so you'll have to give the creation story. But in answer to your question, I was studying birds a long time ago, and it was a population in Peru. I was working in Peru, and they declined about 90% over a 10-year period. And I'm going, what is going on? And I noticed, so have any of you been to Peru?
No.
Yeah, I've been once.
Okay, so to Lima and the desert coast, or to Cusco and Machu Picchu and all those?
Little.
Yeah, oh, okay. Well, as you go along, Peru is a desert coast. I mean, rain is rare. There is one species of plant on the desert for for a lot of the land. And so you go along the road, and all of a sudden you descend into a river valley that's coming from the Andes, and that's carrying water down to the coast. And for about a 2-kilometer stretch on either side of the river, once you get to the coastline, there's agriculture, intensive agriculture. So the birds that I was studying feed in wetlands at the mouths of the rivers. And I learned as I was doing this work, I could smell the agricultural zone. I could smell the river before I could see it because the pesticide use was so intense. Okay, so population declined by 90%. What's going on? Fumes are overwhelming. And there's an interesting aspect to the biology of this bird, which is it spends the winter in Peru on the coast, and it flies to the American Arctic in the summer. So very long distance migrant. And to do that, in the last 3 weeks of its time in the winter, it increases its weight by about 100%, doubles its weight over a 3-week period by eating insects and other invertebrates in the wetland, poking its bill in the mud, okay, picking this stuff up. And clearly with all that pesticide stuff coming down, those invertebrates are heavily laden. And I began to explore some ideas that maybe the decline was due to that contamination. And it was especially interesting because they double their weight, picking up not just food, but also laying fat deposits, so they have the energy to migrate. You know, they fly 3 days nonstop to the next place, and then they spend 2 weeks putting on weight. So all that's happening. And as they fly those 3 days nonstop, they're burning all their fat. Where do the pesticides go? They're reliberated into the bloodstream, and they gather in the one remaining big fat deposit in a bird's body, and that's the brain. It turns out our brain is full of lipids, fats. So I began to wonder, well, maybe the decline in this population is due to some effect that pesticides are having on the brain during migration. So maybe they can't orient the right way. And I began to read about that and talk about that. And one day I was lecturing about this, speculating, because it was pure speculation, at a meeting in Washington, D.C., and this was 1987. And I finished my lecture mostly about migration and basic biology, but a little bit about why is this happening. And after I finished, out of the back comes this woman I never met before. She comes up to me, she grabs me, she says, "Pete, I need to work with you." And this was Theo Colborn. I never met her. And Theo was just beginning to publish data on how many of the places we thought chemicals were causing cancer in animals, in fact, they were causing hormonal problems, hormonal adverse effects in hormonally mediated processes, like the beaks would be curved, like there would be distortions in the growth of the baby fish. And that was that was one of the times when I really began to focus on this. Theo and I worked together for about 10 years, wrote Our Stolen Future as a result of that. So it came out of left field, work on birds. I then changed disciplines. I became an environmental health scientist instead of what I used to be doing, which was basic ecology. And here I am. The big lesson there, follow what's interesting. Okay, don't necessarily stick to what you thought you were committed to. I mean, you should stick to things, but when something new pops up and it's really interesting, that's an opportunity you might want to pursue.
So
Long answer, sorry.
Yeah, fine. So do you know exactly what in these pesticides was causing these birds to stop airborne?
No, we don't. And I spent some serious time looking into that. To suffer from that specific effect?
Yeah.
No. And what I learned was that there was so little known about how birds, how hormonal control of the development of the bird brain gives it the ability to navigate. That work had never been done. It still hasn't been done. And until that basic work is done, then you can't ask questions along the lines of what I wanted to ask there. We did discover, we would sample bird brains and body parts in different points of migration, and we did learn that there were big concentrations of pesticides in the brain. So that part of the hypothesis we were able to confirm. But how it actually worked, still a speculation.
And on the subject of pesticides, we've been reading a lot about the endocrine disruptors. Do you think this could have an effect on anything?
I actually think endocrine disruption has an effect on a lot of things. The World Health Organization, WHO, based in Geneva, part of the UN family of agencies, they issued a report in February of just about a year ago, actually, where they reviewed the current literature, scientific literature on endocrine disruption, and they concluded that endocrine disruption is a global public health threat. So it's a big deal. It's the WHO saying that's the case. Why did they say that? It was a collection of evidence from animals, from experiments, from wildlife observations, from studies of people, and those different sources of information were all adding up, pointing in the same direction. And it's when you get congruence of science done in different ways, done by different people, all adding up to the same thing, that you start really paying attention to it.
And do we have anything to sort of control the endocrine disruptors we're being exposed to?
Yeah, we do. Unfortunately, they're not ideal. There's you and I, everyone here in this room, can take certain steps to reduce our exposures. We can change our diet, you eat lower on the food chain. Many of these things concentrate in fat, which means the more fat that you eat, meat, some dairy products, the more likely you are to be exposed to higher levels. So eat less of that. Don't eat, and I'm not saying eat none of it, because this is all about living life in moderation. So you can make dietary choices that reduce your exposures. You can, for example, there's a wonderful book called Slow Death by Rubber Duck. Anyone guess where that's from?
Well, I've heard of the book. I can't remember where it's from. But
I showed a picture of it, yeah. And it's about, so, a rubber ducky, that little thing that we all played with when we were kids that you can squeeze. The reason why you can squeeze it is because they've added a plasticizer to it called DEHP, which is a phthalate. And it takes PVC, which is an incredibly rigid plastic. You add the phthalate and it makes it squeezable. Okay? And it turns out phthalates are implicated in a wide array of adverse effects by endocrine disrupting compounds. So what these guys did, two of them, they locked themselves in an apartment for a week, they changed their diet, they changed their use of cosmetic products, i.e. cosmetics also contain, some of them contain endocrine disrupting compounds, and they were able to show if they tried to expose themselves by slathering themselves with cosmetics that contain phthalates, phthalates are also used in cosmetics, they could increase their levels. Conversely, if they avoided those products that contain them, they could decrease them. Now that was a sort of it was an experiment, but with a sample size of 2. And so you can't take that to the scientific bank. But there are serious studies that have been published in the peer-reviewed literature that show that dietary choices have an effect. There are many other ways that we can reduce our exposures, and they all make sense, but we shouldn't have to. As people, we should actually be in a situation where those products have been tested, which for the most part they haven't, and where agencies' actions, the regulatory agencies, do things that ensure that endocrine disrupting compounds are not in the marketplace in ways that create exposures. We aren't there yet, unfortunately.
Okay. Out of curiosity, in the study that they conducted with the two people,
Yeah.
in the short period, were there any sort of different changes in their behaviors due to it, or
No, it was too short. And these are like 45, 50-year-old guys, and it's unlikely that a 2-day exposure period to one of these compounds is going to affect an adult in that way. Our big concern with endocrine disruption EDCs is what happens to the fetus during development, or what happens to us. There are times when adults are vulnerable, and they have to do with times when there are big tissue changes going on during puberty, during menopause. So there are times when that's an issue for adults. For the most part, it's an issue for the developing organism.
So having mentioned the fetus just now,
Yeah.
do endocrine disruptors have a more lasting effect than just a single person? Can they continue on through generations, or?
Boy, that's a great question. It's an issue of hot debate right now. When we wrote Our Stolen Future, we thought if we reduce the exposures, we get them out of commerce, we'll go back to normal. Because endocrine disruptors don't change the DNA sequence. They change when genes are being turned on and off. Okay, so we thought reduce the exposures, we're back to zero, and everything's hunky dory. Over the last 7 years, a series of studies have been published that say there actually are ways that some of these changes can be inherited without changes in DNA sequence. It's called epigenetic inheritance, epigenetic transgenerational inheritance. And it was pioneered by a guy named Michael Skinner at Washington State University. And what happens is, so genes have little molecules on top of them that affect whether or not a gene can be turned on or off. Those molecules are called epigenetic markers. And if there's a marker in place, it's hard for that gene to turn on because the hormone can't reach it. Okay, and so typically what happens is a hormone reaches the trigger on the gene turns on and produces a protein through all that molecular mechanism you guys have read about. If the marker is present, the gene can't be turned on. Okay, and so what Skinner learned, was that at certain times in fetal development, maybe not all times, but certain times, if those markers are affected by a chemical, that change can be inherited. If the change takes place in the germ line, i.e. the cells that become either sperm or eggs. If it takes place in a finger, it's not going to be inherited. If it takes place in the eye, it's not going to be. It's only if it takes place in cells that are producing the next generation of sperm and eggs. Okay, so it's a big debate right now. This guy has published probably 10 studies that look into transgenerational inheritance, finding it as a result of multiple chemical exposures. For example, causing effects 4 generations down. After its great-grandmother is exposed while she's pregnant, and great-grandson has the effects manifest even though it's never been exposed. There's some weaknesses to the studies from this lab. And for a while we were thinking, well, he works only at really high doses, and maybe what he's seeing is not relevant to real life. But within the last couple of years, at least 2 studies have been published showing transgenerational epigenetic inheritance as a result of low-level exposures. It's looking uncomfortable right now that this, in fact, might be a way that to understand exposures, we've got to look back multiple generations. which makes the epidemiology of it, the study of the statistical association between exposure and effect, virtually impossible. Because you're never going to know what your grandmother was exposed. What did she eat? So 3 generations prior to you, what did your grandmother have to eat while she was pregnant? We don't know. So I worry about this result because the implications are quite significant.
Right. Moving on from that, we were wondering, we hear regularly that organic food is a solution to kind of like our kind of endocrine food,
Yeah.
in a way. But in a way, we aren't very certain of what that means. Could you maybe clarify that for us?
Sure. Well, I mean, the big question is, what is organic food? Okay, and I think the vernacular, the common definition of that is food grown without pesticides. You can get more technical, but that's what it is. There are a small number of pesticides that aren't synthetic that are permitted to be used by organic farmers, at least under U.S. law, but they're not endocrine disrupting. They tend to be molecules that are part of agriculture and have been part of it for a long time. So organic food is food grown without synthetic pesticides. What we can show is that, for example, there's a great study done maybe 6 or 7 years ago at University of Washington in the U.S., where they got a school to collaborate, and they had kids eat an organic diet for 5 days. And they were able to show, and then they compared pesticides in those kids to the same kids later eating a conventional diet. So, actually it was conventional, organic, conventional. And so they compared what was in their urine. And they were able to show significant differences in pesticide levels, lower with organic food. Now, one way you could respond to that is by saying, yeah, but the levels are so low they don't matter. They aren't biologically effective. Well, a follow-up study is about to come out with the same students. They saved the urine, and now they're analyzing it in a different way. And they're able to show that the physiology of the kids was changed during that time period. Now, they haven't yet followed the kids for long enough to know if there are adverse health effects, but you can no longer argue that the levels are so low there's no effect. There were changes in the physiology measurable in the urine of the kids. So what does it mean? For those kids specifically, we don't know. Kids are developing, their brains are still forming to the age of 21 or 22. That tissue is going to be vulnerable to disruption. Their reproductive organs are going to go through massive reorganization when they reach puberty, so that process is vulnerable to disruption. Lots of other things are still changing. So the consequences will depend upon how much they were exposed to which compounds and what are the effects of the compounds. To give you an idea about sometimes how little we know, I'm sure you all have heard of DDT, right? DDT was used incredibly widely in the 1950s and 1960s and ultimately banned pretty much worldwide in the early 1970s because of fears about breast cancer. A paper was published just this week showing that people suffering from Alzheimer's were exposed to 4 times as much DDT as people who aren't suffering from Alzheimer's. So, and no one had ever even speculated about DDT and Alzheimer's before this paper. So we're learning about these consequences all the time. Now, I should be careful to point out that this was one study, and it was a statistical association, and you can't prove causation with statistical associations. You can generate hypotheses that then further study will help resolve. But in some of these, it's just astounding to me every time one of these new research findings come out on a completely different endpoint that no one had a clue was related to exposure to that compound. That's, to a significant degree, we're often flying in the dark on these because so little testing is required to use materials in commerce.
So, what advantages would you say are there to organic foods?
Can I rephrase that question a little bit? So why, you might
Could
say
you
why?
elaborate why organic foods are better for you then?
Well, the simple answer is exposures are lower to pesticides. There aren't zero pesticides in organic food, first because of the reason I said, and second because synthetic pesticides often evaporate and they can travel long distances and settle down in much lower levels on organic foods. So I'd ask the following question, or let me rephrase that. If you ask, what are the advantages, and is it worth it for me to pay the advantages, to pay for organic food, the extra that it costs? I would rephrase that to say, well, do I want to pay a little bit more to a farmer or a lot more to a doctor because of the potential health consequences of eating conventional pesticides? Right now, when you eat a conventional produce and you are exposed to a contaminant that may cause infertility, or it may cause attention hyperactivity disorder, or it may contribute to your risk of breast cancer, or Parkinson's disease, or Alzheimer's, all of which have been linked in various ways to pesticides. You, as the consumer, are paying the price of healthcare for that disease. The conventional producer avoids all those costs. They don't have to pay anything. And in essence, we are subsidizing them with our health. That makes sense? We are subsidizing them with our health. Why should that be? Shouldn't the pricing system somehow reflect the fact that they're getting away free? They are selling more products because it's cheaper, but it's not really cheaper because it's costing us our health.
Yeah.
Okay.
And on a sort of another point, so when we see these pesticides, which are sprayed on these plants in fields, do we see what sort of effect they have on the soil in which these plants are grown in?
Boy, that's another excellent question. I'll give you one example, because there are huge effects on the soil ecosystem of heavy use of pesticides, huge consequences. So you've probably studied how bacteria fix nitrogen fixing bacteria. They form a symbiotic relationship with beans and other leguminaceous plants. And the way that relationship develops is the bacteria is in the soil, the seed sprouts and its roots begin to grow, and it sends out a little signal, a chemical signal, into the soil. And basically it's telling the bacteria, come on over here, let's collaborate. I'll feed you if you fix nitrogen. So it's a mutualistic relationship between the bacteria and the plant, and together the bacteria does the nitrogen fixing, but the plant then incorporates it and grows. So it turns out we've some really interesting research done by Tulane University in New Orleans discovered that some of the pesticides that are in common use interfere with that signaling process. So the plant sends out the signal and says, hey, come on, let's team up. The bacteria never hears it because the chemicals, the pesticides, interfere with that signaling system. So that's just one example of many in which pesticides can alter soil function.
Okay. Building on to that, when we look at farms that use chemical or pesticides, obviously there's, as you were saying, a great negative effect on the soil, and there's topsoil erosion that just disappears because we overuse it. So is there a treatment process that can regrow the topsoil, that can fix it?
Actually, there is, and it's called composting. There's an amazing example of the effect of composting. Basically what you have to do is reintegrate plant material. which has lots of carbon in it and other nutrients. And over time, actually relatively small amounts of time, you can you can get soil back to a healthy state. This example, I can give Diony the link to it, has taken place over the last 20 years in Egypt, in the desert, where this Egyptian farmer began to experiment with composting, and over a 20-year period worked this out to such an extent that I forget, 20,000 people now live, have built their local village, their town or city around the center of composting, bringing organic material, putting it back into desert soil, which had been depleted. And I heard him talk in London in December about this. And he said, you know, we'd been doing this for 20 years, and we've not just gotten the soil back and great organic food from it and helped build a community where there hadn't been a community before and provided work for people in a place that was devoid of employment opportunities. We decided we would see how long it took us to recreate soil using what we've figured out how to do in the Sinai Desert. Okay, this is like absolute desert. And this guy asked the audience, about 300 people, so tell me, how long do you think it took us to get our first crop, radishes or cucumbers or something, out of this compost, this soil that had been regenerated by compost? 5 years. No, 7 years. And it took them 18 months. What you can do with compost, if you use it systematically, can be quite extraordinary. And of course, composting puts carbon into the soil, which is better for greenhouse stuff, much, much better. And so there are also a whole series of experiments underway. How do you combine the carbon benefits of these approaches, reducing greenhouse gas emissions, with the nutritional benefits and the ability to feed a lot more people in a sustainable way? I will make sure I give Diony that link, because it's a very inspiring talk.
That'd be brilliant.
I'm sorry, how does the process work again?
This thing of using compost?
Yeah.
Basically, you're taking organic matter, vegetables that we're not going to eat, plant waste that is a byproduct of growing food, and putting it in the soil. You first aggressively compost it. You provide water, you turn it over, you make sure there's an appropriate mixture of different types of vegetable waste so that it's got lots of different types of nutrients. Then depending upon the temperature and how much water you put in, that process of composting can be complete in a matter of a month or two or longer. But once you have the compost done in its degradation processes, it's incredibly rich soil, and you fold it into the sand, and so here you've got literally sand in the Sinai. It had almost no organic matter. You work hard, use these materials which were going to be waste, and you recreate soil. It's like I said, it's a very positive story.
And can we match the production of organic food and inorganic food? And what should we do to change if they're not proportional, the production?
That's also an excellent question, and it's a matter of much debate right now, because we're headed towards a much larger population, and we've got to figure out what we can do as a global society to feed a larger number of people at a time when we're having trouble feeding everyone now. If you look carefully at that, you learn that our inability to feed everyone now, a lot of it has to do with flaws in the distribution system, with some people having a lot of excess and some people having way too little. Right now, the Food and Agriculture Organization, another part of the UN, they issued a report 2 years ago that said if you look at the food system as a whole, we waste 40% of food right now. 40%. So that's a path. I mean, we could have 40% more if we were better at dealing with waste. If you look at some of the numbers comparing conventional agriculture with organic agriculture, they suggest that the productivity differences between the two types can be much less. It takes intelligence to do organic agriculture. You got to be able to think. You got to be able to respond rapidly to conditions, but you can. Conventional agriculture, especially monoculture, it reduces the number of jobs. It at least sometimes raises the productivity, at least temporarily, until the soil is depleted and you can't. So it's maybe a good short-term solution, but it could be a long-term hole into which we might not be able to climb out. So and then if you compare, for example, the economic benefits of specific pesticides that are used in conventional agriculture, in this monoculture, those economic benefits actually can be minuscule compared to the overall benefit of the crop. So atrazine, which is a widely used pesticide, when agricultural economists who are not associated with, I'll say it, with the chemical industry, when they calculate what's the benefit of using that pesticide, it's about maybe a 1% increase in productivity. It's almost trivial, particularly when compared with 40% food wastage. So we have to change the frame. We have to change how we're thinking about what's long-term, what's sustainable. Do we want to produce a lot more for a very short time period and then not be able to produce very much at all? How do we balance that? That's a problem you all are going to have to solve.
And why is organic more expensive than regular?
It's more expensive because it takes more labor. That's probably the biggest source, because it does require more labor. You don't have one farmer with a huge tractor able to take care of by himself or herself of thousands of acres. Instead, you have to have many people participating to that. But wait a second, don't we need employment opportunities for people? Shouldn't we be weighing that need into the calculation? So there are differences in what it requires to do organic farming. I was visiting a 2,000-acre organic farm a couple of years ago, and I got taken around by the head farmer of this place. It happened to be Prince Charles's organic farm. And I got taken around by the head farmer, and he was a genius. I didn't realize how intellectually interesting farming can be if you do it intelligently. And the only way you can do organic farming is intelligently, because you got to balance all sorts of things without being able to fall back on large produce. Is more expensive if you look at the cost in the supermarket. But if you look at the total cost, like I said, do you want to pay more, a little bit more to the farmer, or a lot more to your doctor? It isn't cheaper. Conventional produce is not cheaper in the long run.
To elaborate more in the long run, what are the national solutions to this? Because eventually it's not going to be feasible for us to continue to consume like we are. So what are the national solutions to stopping this? Because eventually we're not going to be able to farm anymore. We're not going to have to eat.
That's a very big question. And you're talking about stopping population growth?
Not so much population growth, so much as finding a feasible method to continue the population as it is without having large non-excess amounts of food that's just sort of disappeared. So being able to continue to feed the population without having to rely so heavily on the pesticides to produce that much.
I think that if there is one silver bullet for all this, and of course there's no silver bullets for anything as complicated as this, but something gets close to it, it's if we manage to change how food is priced. As I was saying earlier, right now there are a lot of costs that are externalized. That's how economists refer to it. It means that the producer of conventional food doesn't pay for your health care, doesn't pay for the costs that their practices impose on you. And that makes it cheaper for them to sell that food than comparable food that's grown organically. Okay? So what if we had a worldwide agreement that says we're going to do the best we can to internalize all those costs? That would send hugely different signals into the marketplace. You would be able to say, oh, actually, that conventional produce really is more expensive because it's causing health problems, or it's causing social problems, it's causing soil depletion, it's causing all these other things that aren't reflected in what you pay in the market today. This is true for a wide array of problems. Carbon. The cost of using carbon are externalized by the oil companies. They're getting away scot-free for all the, at least right now, for all the consequences of sea level rise combined with extreme weather, which has had devastating effects around the world. Those are costs, as far as we can tell, which are due to massive use of carbon-based fuels. And yet the price doesn't reflect that. So if we could somehow get global agreement or national agreement or state agreement, some political level, we're going to internalize these costs, that would be the single most important thing we could accomplish.
To what extent do mainstream supermarkets provide organic food? What accessibility do we have? How much
Well, here in Switzerland, I don't know. I do know that I was shopping at a co-op just 2 days ago, Micro. They've got a whole bio section. Now, it's not very big. There's places in the U.S., a store chain called Whole Foods, which has targeted this market as that's how it views itself, as providing healthy food to people who want to make healthy choices. That market, organic food in the U.S., is pretty much the fastest growing sector in the food business today. Tells you something. Tells you consumers are paying attention to these health costs, health risks. I don't know the numbers off the top of my head about what specific portions. I do know the direction is up, and it's strongly up, and that's actually interesting because it's sending signals to farmers. You get more value from what you're growing on your land? Maybe you should try organic. And that creates a positive feedback loop, because my understanding here in Switzerland is one of the constraints on the distribution of organic food is this perception that not everyone wants it, and therefore there isn't a market for it. The more realization there is that there's a market for it, the more farmers are going to have economic incentive to shift to it. We can make the market work for us in cases like this.
And what are healthy plastics?
That's the trick question, isn't it?
Plastic, yeah.
Okay.
Healthy plastic.
Well, I know what. That's okay. There.
So smooth.
Do you want to rephrase the question?
What is healthy plastic?
Should we just void that
That's what
question?
it says.
No, actually, it's an interesting question.
That's actually what it says.
Yeah. So right now we know about a lot of unhealthy plastics. We know about ways we shouldn't use those plastics if we want to reduce our health risks. We also know why some of those plastics are unhealthy, not just generally, but at the specific molecular mechanism. That plastic is unhealthy because its monomer, the basic molecule that's used to build the chain that makes it a plastic, its monomer interacts with a hormone receptor that then does bad things to the endocrine system. Okay, and so there are 46 nuclear reactors, different types of not nuclear energy reactors, but I meant receptors. Excuse me. There are 46 nuclear receptors, different types of hormone receptors in the nucleus of the cell, And we know a lot about what are the characteristics of a molecule that allow it to stimulate that receptor. Okay? And so what some people think is that if we know enough about that and we do the testing right, we may be able to identify plastic materials that can't harm us by affecting the endocrine system. There's a lot of active research on that today. Right now, what I can tell you is that for the most part, we don't have enough information about the plastics that we think may be safe to know that they're safe. And the other complication, so plastic is the basic molecule of plastic it's a monomer that's been polymerized. It's been made into a chain. And how do they do that? Typical chemical company making plastics has a complicated recipe, does it in the open air. Contaminants get into the plastic from the air. So no two batches of plastic are the same. Think about that. No two batches of plastic are the same because this one was made at this time when there was a discharge coming from that factory upwind, and it went in, some of it settled into that plastic, and it added something that it wasn't added by design, it was added by accident. And one of the big health mysteries about plastics is how much of that process contributes to the unhealthy nature of some plastics. And we just don't know the answers because it's really complicated. I do think that we can make monomers that are inherently safe if we test them properly. But that hasn't become part of standard practice yet. Good question.
Recently, a study was done in Stanford claiming that the nutrient value in organic food is same as in conventional food.
Mm-hmm.
So what's your opinion about that?
Well, that's an interesting study. It was quite highly promoted when it came out. Lots of discussion in the media about it. My first reaction to it was, wait a second, the reason why I eat organic food isn't because of nutritional advantages, it's because they don't have pesticides. Okay, and that study ignored that issue completely. Okay, then some people dug into it, and it turns out that it was funded by big ag companies. Okay, and then the author of it stopped responding. When that came out, the author of it stopped responding to press questions, and the university backed away from it. It came from a prestigious university, but even science done at prestigious universities can sometimes be questionable. So, no discussion of pesticide advantages of organic food, and links to big ag make me suspect. Along the same lines, a study that came out last month, reporting that organic milk has some oils that are known to be at higher levels than conventional milk that are known to be important for brain development. Okay, so let's be fair. That study was paid for by an organic milk company. So where do you go with that? Sometimes this whole issue of vested interest funding research by people who benefit economically from the outcome, you always pay attention to that. Who funded it? Okay.
How do you say do you think the government's doing anything to intervene at the moment, or how much more involvement do you think is needed?
Swiss government, I don't know. Okay. Governments generally, they tend to be in the business of protecting pesticides, not protecting people. Sorry.
And do you think this needs to change, and
I think
how
it
much?
needs to change profoundly. The regulatory agencies that are involved in determining what's safe and what's not are using, they're using outdated science. It's sort of like using the science that was used to develop black and white televisions as the science used to develop iPhones. Okay. The regulatory agencies are still in black and white television age. We need science that reflects what we know today, and theirs doesn't. And that puts us, consumers, at a tremendous disadvantage.
Okay. Another just sort of random question is, how do you fund your research that you've done over the past several years? Where is it all
Sure.
come from?
My research, my organization is funded by U.S. foundations that typically have been established sometime 10, 20, 30, 40 years ago, and they make grants. And so I apply for grants. Sometimes I get a grant from them, sometimes I don't. So my organization isn't allowed to take government funding for a different reason than you might expect. We can't take government funding because usually having government funding has immense overhead. You have to do, incredibly onerous audits. You have to have the ability to process all the paper that they require you to process. And we decided it's just not worth it. We also take individual contributions. We raised, just like, you put the donate button on it. We raised maybe $100,000 this year on a donate button.
Okay, we'd like to thank you so much for your time.
Great.
here.
Well, let me thank you for what Pinecones are doing. I look forward to hearing more.
Oh, the metaphor, right.
What's the metaphor?
Okay, so the idea is that Pinecone is a storage facility for seeds for the pine tree. And the idea is that we, being Pinecone, we plant the seed for the next generation of Pinecone to then grow out of, to then plant the seed again. And it's this continuous process that you just keep planting the ideas and spreading it. And eventually you have...
That's great.
Healthy future.
That sounds sustainable. So thanks for coming by.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very
Thank you.
much.